Yes, yes.
Okay. आपने लाइव कर दिया ना
Yes, ma'am.
सर?
You are live.
All right, fantastic. So this is a good time to say thank you for being here so early on a Saturday morning. I hope everyone's got their coffee. Uh, it is my job to introduce our newly minted Office of Ideas, which is the Office of Interdisciplinary Studies here at the Jindal Global University, aptly titled Ideas. It serves as a university-wide incubator for interdisciplinary research by providing institutional space for what we like to call cross-pedagogical learning and research. The idea, if you will, behind ideas is to facilitate collaborations across scholars in JGU, external collaborators, practitioners, policymakers, think tanks, and civil society stakeholders to encourage research in multidisciplinary with a multidisciplinary outlook. Uh, so within this larger sort of ideas framework, we have a group called JUST, which stands for justice. I mean, just should stand for justice. I suppose that makes sense. It's justice, urban spaces, and technology. So we have a sort of wide-ranging interdisciplinary workspace to play with. As advertised, we work on urban spaces, technology, and ideas of justice. Today's two panels are an attempt to bring these three elements together. And our work basically tries to combine insights from fields of urban studies, social psychology, SDS, which is science and technology studies, sociology, and any related fields to study all of this sort of all the dynamics between these in these urban landscapes. Um, at the heart of our inquiry, as you might have read on our website, is the central question of how can we envision cities that prioritize justice and compassion in this fast-paced urban milieu. Through collaborative research and dialogue, we're trying to, try to find a path towards more inclusive and caring urban environments where every resident's dignity and well-being are upheld. We have two panels today to talk about all of these issues. The first panel is here already, and let me, without further ado, invite Dr. Namesh Kilamsetti to introduce the first panel and, declare the symposium open. Over to you, Namesh.
Thank you so much, Vidya. Good morning to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in this panel discussion as a part of the symposium of our launch of Just. This panel, the first panel discussion that we have, focuses particularly about evictions. When we talk of slum evictions, this has been a common event in cities of the global south that has been affecting lives and livelihoods of millions of the urban poor that live in these cities. Evictions continue to remain as a stable policy, which has been exercised fairly frequently, even though they have been affecting the poor and the marginalized populations adversely. In order to understand this phenomenon in a better way, and more particularly the injustices that surround evictions for the people who live in slums, we have two panelists today speaking on this issue, both from an academic as well as from a practitioner's perspective. First, we have Dr. Amit Patel, who is an associate professor of public policy and public affairs at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. His research has extensively focused on studying poverty and inequality in urban areas, emphasizing in particular on bottom-up approaches that improve the socioeconomic outcomes for the urban poor. Today, he would inform us about evictions from an academic perspective through one of his recent projects where even I am a collaborator in. We've been working together on this. Alongside Dr. Patel, we complementing him is Mr. Anuj Bahel, a researcher and a journalist primarily working on the themes of housing and land rights, urban informality and climate change, all through specifically focusing on the lens of exclusivity of urban inequalities. Anuj would provide the practitioner's perspective of understanding evictions based on his own evictions of being there in the field, as well as his involvement through reports of that of published by the Housing and Land Rights Network. Without wasting any further time, let us start this discussion by first inviting Dr. Patel to bring in his perspective. Before first and foremost, I sincerely thank Dr. Patel to be a part of this symposium, considering the fact that it's almost midnight there in Boston, and he's graciously agreed to be a part of this talk. So we'll start with you, Dr. Patel. As we had discussed, we'll spend 15 minutes with each panelist while you can give in your perspective and have your talk. Once we are done with both the presentations and all the talks as such, We'll have a moderated Q&A followed by any audience, followed by discussing any audience-based questions. Thank you so much. Over to you, Dr. Patel.
Thank you very much, Namesh and Vidya, for inviting me. And this is truly a subject that keeps me awake at night. So it's perfectly fine for me to wake up at midnight and talk about it. I'll share the screen. As Namesh mentioned, this is in fact a collaborative project, and I had a great honor to work with Namesh on this for several years now. And we have several students who have joined us over time to help us with this project. And I wouldn't name all of them right away, but they're all listed on the slide. This is really a systematic review of slum evictions. So what we are really doing is looking at the evidence on slum evictions around the globe that is reported in scientific literature, and trying to find out what are the common themes that are emerging from this literature, what we can learn from it, both for research and practice. What are the policy implications of these studies? What has worked, what has not worked, what should be done differently? Does eviction as a policy option even work, and in what context? So we started with that kind of initial query, and eviction is one of the many policies. I will discuss some of them. And so our larger project is actually to look at effectiveness of all slum policies that has been tried and tested in last 7 or 8 decades around the globe. So let me start with first those who are new to the subject of slums. This is largely a global South's problem today. It historically has been global North's problem as well. But as you can see today, what we call slums, the places that are highly dense, often lacks basic infrastructure like water and sanitation, is largely a global South's urban issue. And estimates vary based on who you ask, but about 1 billion people live in slums around the global South. And so if this is such a large issue, what response have been tried? And so if we look at that, and this is fairly common, but if we look at India post-independence, we thought this is a transient issue. They will go away and eventually everybody will be in a nice housing, but that didn't happen. Slums were permanent. So we tried public housing, but that was not sufficient given the scale of the problem. We tried a World Bank driven project called Sites and Services. And what we tried to do is give them a site elsewhere and destroyed the current housing stock that was in the form of slums, and expected urban poor to build another house at the new site. And as you can imagine, building another second house in a lifetime is quite hard, even for middle class. So for poor, it was almost impossible. Then somewhat successful strategy was slum upgradation, where people provided services at the location where they already had a house. And that worked because location is a key factor in why people live where they live, even if housing is not of high quality, and because of their access to jobs and other employment opportunities. There was a wave of giving them land titles, and people thought that's a way out of poverty if they formally owned the house. So that was 1990s. In 2000, we have mostly talked about rhetorics like cities without slums and Millennium Development Goals that talked about 100 million slum dwellers, which is a fraction of 1 billion. And then we have Sustainable Development Goals that are a little broader than slums. But overall, what we have seen is that evictions are here since 1950s. All these different experimentations happened, but we haven't seen anything changing with respect to evictions. That have been evictions in 50s, and even today evictions continue to happen. So we never call it a policy, but because it has been practiced, is by default a policy. And so we said we will look at evictions as a matter of policy and see what we find out from the literature review. If we look at the slum-related systematic reviews, most of them have looked at as the kind of chart I showed you, how slum policies have evolved over time. Then there are some studies that talked about how different slum interventions, such as slum upgrading, could lead to different health outcomes. So this is fairly common in public health. Systematic reviews as a method is in fact coming from medicine and public health. So that's fairly common. What we don't know is that there is no systematic review on what kind of policies work, what kind of policies do not work. If we have to do evictions, in what manner, and that's something we haven't tested before. I'll give you a brief overview of the method. It basically provides an up-to-date meta-analysis of all the papers that have been published on a given subject, and it could be done on anything, but it collates empirical evidence into a single paper so that if you read that, you have a state-of-the-art understanding of what has been published so far. So it's kind of a lay of the land of a field or a specific subject within a field. So what we did is looked up in two databases, SSCI and JSTOR. Specific search terms were used to look up for the papers. So we found those papers, then we classified them into policy-related papers, semi-policy papers that has some implication, and papers that were studying evictions but didn't have direct bearing on the policy. And we focused on policy and semi-policy paper in our final review that we're doing, and then we will identify the themes. So we had some working definitions of how to classify what's policy and semi-policy paper. And then to give you some sense, there are thousands of results that come up when you search slum evictions on JSTOR, for example. But when we read the abstract, look at the title, we could tell that many of them are not directly relevant for policy. And so that's what filtering that we did. And so we have about 100 plus papers that are in policy, but several more in semi-policy that we continue to review, but we have reviewed most of them now. So main themes that emerge from this is that the location is one of the key aspects. When people are evicted, the challenges that come with relocation, you're thrown out in periphery, and as a result, you lose the livelihood. All of those things are clubbed into location theme. There is cause of evictions. There are lots of papers that talk about why slums were evicted. So things like city beautification or projects like infrastructure development projects like metro and so on are the causes. Mode of evictions vary quite a lot, but they are reported like was the police or military deployed for evictions, or bulldozing or arson and so on. Then there are papers that report impact, papers that report size of evictions, how many people were evicted, papers that report what resistance strategies that communities used, and then papers talk about words that are used in policy documents, in court orders, and in media, and in general portrayal of evictions, or portrayal of slums as negative, like eyesores or disease of the city and so on, that are used as a justification for evictions. Then we identify stakeholders from these papers. Who are the players that are important in eviction processes? What kind of rights are violated, like human rights in the process of eviction? Discrimination, such as like communities are specifically targeted because of that identity as religious minority or caste minority. And methods. This is for researchers, like what research methods have been used in in these papers, and where are the gaps. So these are like main themes to give you some sense where the studies are, most studies are done, as you can imagine. Places where eviction happens fairly commonly, but also the places that are where there is some freedom of press and research are the places that are prominent in this. So as you can imagine, India is one place where studies are done, and India is also a place where evictions happen fairly regularly. There are many other places, but it's possible the researchers are not able to report on those, or the studies are not coming out of those places. But this is kind of general picture. We also looked at like people are studying whole cities or specific slums or a whole country in their papers. And so that's the breakup on the top right. Um, there are size of evictions reported. Papers report in different forms like households, number of people, number of slums. So there's no consistency, but we can get some sense of the size of evictions, like are larger slums more likely to be evicted, smaller slums likely to get more evictions, and so on. To give you some sense of triggers or justifications for events, as as you can imagine, like when Mr. Trump visits a city, the path from airport to his venue might be cleared. Is that small little thing of event of like a visit of a dignitary to the events like Commonwealth Games, etc., that could lead to evictions. But then there is a general stereotyping aesthetics of the city, like cities should be beautiful, riverfront should be beautiful, and so we need to get rid of slums. They are eyesores and things like that. So so there are lots of slum-related, slum characteristics-related things that are going on. There are some non-slum related things, like there's nothing to do with the fact that FIFA World Cup is happening here. That has nothing to do with slums, but slums would be the victim of such an hosting event. There are also market forces when the land is under pressure, such as like now Dharavi. There is economic value for the land underneath that becomes a problem for the slum, and eventually they are more prone to get evicted. If we talk about modes of evictions, there are lots of sanctioned modes like police and legal action, like you serve the notice and ask them to leave, use the military, and so on. But there are also non-sanctioned modes of evictions like arson that people suspect is not is done to evict the slums, and it's of course not easy to prove those, but there are lots of forceful things like disconnect water services in order to get them out of the place, and using goons and mafias, physical violence. These are the kind of things that you would see that it's not sanctioned in the eviction order, but is carried out when evictions happen. And in about half the papers report modes of eviction. If you look at semantics, there's some text and speeches. There's like lots of negative social construction, like they're referred as social scourge, undesirables, metaphors like cancerous growth, stereotyping like they are terrorists or criminals. There is also planning related phrases used like, we want to return to order, and we want orderly urbanization. We want slum-free cities, or zero slums by 2022. All those kind of things are rhetorics, and the semantics helps politicians and policymakers to carry out evictions with ease because they can win the popular notion that slums are problems, right? And if you look at stakeholders, there's a range of stakeholders. There are lots of people who are pro-communities, and mainly civil society and academic institutions, some celebrities like Shabana Azmi who would speak up, or royal families in Thailand who would say, stand up behind a slum that has historically served the palace. But there are also pro-eviction people like street-level bureaucrats, even Supreme Court in the case of Delhi. Resident welfare organizations for the middle classes near slums, landowners of the land underneath, local business people, police. They have been pro-eviction and have been the stakeholders in getting this process carried out. Victims tend to be ethnic minorities, residents from nearby villages, religious minorities, caste minorities, elderly, children, women, persons with disabilities, because when the process happens, it's them who gets the most suffering. Impacts vary a lot. We are looking at impacts related to shelter, like what happens, like your house is damaged, you lose all the material. There are financial losses, economic losses. When you lose a job, people don't invest in their new home because they are worried about eviction. They lost the location and the livelihood. There are health impacts, like people die during the eviction process. People get hurt, then of course there are mental health impacts after the eviction on children and others. There's loss of social network because of the new place. They wouldn't have the same neighbors and so on. They also lose documents, important documents. Sometimes they get incarcerated if they resist. And so I'll just stop here with a few implications for research and practice. There are lots of small cities, small slums that are not studied. There are several countries where evictions are not studied in depth yet. There is also no specific research protocol, so the researchers sometimes report evictions in numbers of people who were evicted. Sometimes they don't report it. Sometimes they don't report whether the eviction mode was bulldozing or legal notices and so on. So it's there are no standard databases, so gross underreporting, and so research needs to catch up on eviction studies a lot. There are also lots of policy and practice implications. Time and over, human and constitutional rights are violated in eviction processes. There's not sufficient time given, like the middle of monsoon, they're asked to leave overnight or in a very hot day of summer. And these are sometimes intentionally done to harass slum dwellers. There's no fair compensation. People are not put first. It's usually the land that most people are interested in, and that's what driving eviction processes. The social construction of slum dwellers is also negative. So these are some of the things we need to fix. So I'll stop here. I hope I finished in 15 minutes.
Yes, almost there. Thank you so much. I think it was right around the 15 minutes mark. Thank you so much, Dr. Patel. I think this kind of provides a great perspective because now this presentation kind of lays out a macro view in terms of what has been happening when we talk about evictions at a larger level and the different kind of impacts that it has been bringing in to people who live in slums. I think now what would complement really well is if I invite Anuj in, where he can bring in his perspectives on the ground. And meanwhile, while Anuj is reading up, it would be great for the audience to just keep sending us our questions in the Q&A box so that we can ask both the panelists after the presentations are over. Thank you. Anuj, over to you.
Thank you, Ramesh. I'll just share my screen. Give me a second.
Yes.
I hope the screen is visible. Yeah. I actually want to start this presentation with this statistical figure you guys can see on your screen. This figure of around 7.4 lakh, and it's a result of research which was being conducted over the 2 years, documenting the individuals who have been displaced due to forced evictions in India. I've added this to the slides just to recognize that behind this numerical figure lies the gravity of the issue. Each unit represents a person who has been rendered homeless by the state under various pretexts. Like Amit also pointed out, be it infrastructural development, environmental reasons, or most significantly, encroachment removal in urban centers, often justified as slum clearances or city beautification projects. Because when legitimate purposes of development are lacking, it becomes convenient for the state to label people as encroachers. These are individuals who have been living in these cities for generations. yet have never felt a sense of belonging to in the city. Picture this, for example, a family of Gadiya Lohars, a nomadic Iron Smith community, migrating into the city and settling on the outskirts of the Delhi, where once they were only vast farmlands, but now they have discovered a suitable market for their iron products, which proved invaluable to the farmers in the area, fostering mutual growth for both the communities. However, as Delhi rapidly urbanizes over time, these farmlands gradually transformed into bustling urban developments, with the peripheries evolving into urban cores. Eventually, farmlands disappeared. Consequently, the demand for their equipment also diminished, and the Gadiya Lohars, who had never been integrated into the formal land ownership systems, found themselves becoming the new pavement dwellers of the city. They began adding layers to their juggies on the pavements, incrementally expanding to sustain their daily livelihoods, with their makeshift shops still in front and dwellings at the back. However, as the city and its governing state hesitated to recognize these citizens as legitimate residents, they were stripped of basic housing security, facing one eviction after the another. The daily existence has become overshadowed by the constant fear and anxiety of when the government might arrive with bulldozer to demolish their homes. The image you may see on the screen depicts one such settlement of Gadiya Lohars, located near Shamlal College in Delhi. Initially, these people are settled in Mansarovar Park. However, with the urban expansion, the government constructed a flyover at the same site of Mansarovar Park, ultimately necessitating the relocation of these residents. They moved a short distance ahead and established the juggi a few meters away, near a underpass actually. So subsequently, the government planned to build an underpass beneath an area, and in 2011, promoting them to relocate once again to the current site near Shamlal College. So in the recent years, again, the challenges have only intensified for the Gadiya Lohars of Shamlal College. This settlement has been demolished twice in the span of last 2 years. And over the years, if I talk about, multiple settlements have been evicted one after the another in Delhi in the guise of urban development. Families were abruptly uprooted from the only homes they had ever known, their belongings scattered, and their sense of security shattered in an instant. But where could they return? That's the important question we should ask. With the state simply removing people without addressing the question of where they should settle next, individuals are left mostly fend for themselves. In this regard, these evictions that you're talking about are not limited to the megacities like Delhi, which I'll mostly be focusing on today, but they vary across various tier cities. On the map displayed on the screen, you can see a list of smaller towns, settlements, and even villages where we have documented forced evictions in recent years, or where we were able to actually found ground reports. So most of the parts in India, we also have this. Is this a possibility, for example, that maybe a city like Bareilly will not have accurate reporting around the same case then eviction happened or not? Maybe it will just get ignored, or just imagine an eviction happening in this time in Imphal. Nobody would ever get to know what happens there. So it's actually an understated figure and representation, but still it holds some sort of value to begin with, And forced, like Amit was also mentioning, like forced evictions not only strips individual of their physical dwellings, but it also erodes the sense of belonging and stability, which they had been striving to establish in the city for years. Moreover, like forced evictions are not isolated incidents that should also be considered. They perpetuate a cycle of poverty, inequality, and social injustice. Displaced individuals often struggle to access basic services such as healthcare, education, and employment, further increasing the degree of their marginality. Hence, it constitutes, I think, a systematic violation of multiple human rights. If I'm not, I actually, yes. And extending from the right to adequate housing and personal security to rights such as health, education, freedom of movement, and more. Furthermore, like I was talking before, the psychological toll of forced evictions cannot be overshadowed too. Individuals and communities subjected to evictions often experience profound feeling of loss, grief, and helplessness. The right to freedom from cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment is thus violated. And as people are subjected to emotional distress and trauma, And in recent years, forced evictions frequently executed by the state have attached significant attention. It's not a phenomenon which we're not talking about. We open news media portals these days, we see people talking about evictions, although eviction itself is not a very new phenomenon. Various government initiatives aimed at urban development have often resulted in the removal of the urban poor. Take, for example, the example of Commonwealth Games in Delhi, which Amit was also talking about. Over 2 lakh people were displaced between 2006 and 2010. However, in current discourse, the term bulldozer has gained prominence, symbolizing a reality which is now perfectly accepted by people, I think. And the terms like bulldozer Raj, bulldozer action, bulldozer Baba, even terms like in the context of yogi, we have heard Mama Ka bulldozer. Many such terms have found their ways to the vocabulary of all of the citizens, if everyday citizens, both left and right leaning news media platforms extensively cover bulldozer actions. Maybe one focusing on just how bulldozer has become a sign of justice, or the other highlighting how forced evictions and displacement have morphed into punitive measures by states, particularly targeting certain communities and urban minorities. If we talk about again these communities, I think it's very clear that these communities are notably Muslims and Dalits. Further, I think Muslim neighborhoods across the country have become the targets, from Mathura in Uttar Pradesh to even Dwarka in Gujarat, with various neighborhoods in Delhi also facing erasure, which were Muslim population dominated. Even as per our own statistical evidence from the reports, around 47% of the affected people through the past 2 years who were affected by forced evictions were Muslims. The phenomenon of bulldozer injustice has only become more prevalent in conversation, but has also gained acceptance and normalization among the masses. For instance, in the just past 2 years, I think, Delhi has witnessed over 70 eviction drives. If we calculate this almost accounts for 1 eviction drive in every 10 days. So this reflecting a number of numbers persistent at the beginning of this presentation, and considering the data collected over the past 7 years, it becomes evident that the state's approach to urban development and city beautification often translates into erasure of poor and the settlements, and the scale has dramatically increased at this point. We would even working in the sector for housing rights, we've never seen so many demolitions occurring in just 1 year. And even not usually earlier it was the fact maybe around 2 lakh people would be displaced across the country, but now these statistics have raised to a stagnant figure of 5 lakhs, 3.5 lakhs. So the nature of this demolition drive has undergone a significant change as well. It's not just the number which has increased. So over the years, different from the affected people seem disappearing also. For instance, during one of the eviction drives I reported on in the Nanakpura area of Delhi, a massive police force comprising of 100 officials and additional 100 CRPF Jawans were deployed to dismantle just a settlement of 70 to 80 households. Just imagine that. To remove a settlement or a basti of 70 to 80 households, there is 100 police Jawans, and then there are CRPF people. Do you think people would be able to even defend at this point? For residents, however, even barred from entering their own homes to claim their possessions. Another concerning trend is the lack of prior notices given in most of these settlements, leaving people with insufficient time to organize or prepare for eviction. In some cases, Pragati Maidan, for example, last year, where G20 occurred, bulldozer arrived at the settlement as early as 5 in the morning, catching residents completely unaware with barricades preventing them any access into the settlement, and there was again heavy police deployment around the site. So the new ways in which demolitions are being carried out with a mechanism like this, the immediate clearance of demolition sites, erasing any trace of the settlement existence, no prior or adequate notice, denying access to civil societies groups and journalists to cover the stories, are just a few ways in which the nature of evictions has evolved over the years. It has not only become a tool for questionable development, but also a means for the state to assert its authority and power at this point, And the basic principles and guidelines of development-based eviction and displacement, if I talk about, provides a very clear operational guidelines to be followed before, during, and after the eviction. However, in almost all incidents of forced evictions across the country in the past years, state authorities did not follow due processes or requirements, like I talked about. This includes, again, incidents of eviction without adequate notice, demolition in inclement weather, or even during the pandemic, there were no stoppage to demolition. Government was still demolishing one structure after the another. and even before and during school examinations, and within the use of disproportionate force at this point. It's also interesting to note that the reasons for the evictions have evolved over the years. The rising number of evictions ostensibly carried out under the banner of encroachment removal and city beautification has gained significance as the India hosted G20 summit also in 2023. The juxtaposition between the grandeur of G20 summit's nationwide presence and the simultaneous execution of encroachment removal drives by the state, in Delhi especially, underscores a clear correlation with this thing. And now what lies here is the role of court and justice, what Amit was also talking about in this scenario. So I do not know where Amit very clearly put the courts in the yoke of pro-evictions, but I think this was actually not the scene before. So 50% of the people which we are talking about who've been displaced in the who have been displaced in 2023 were due to the court orders. This means that at some point, the court had the opportunity to intervene, to issue a stay or release and prevent the displacements. However, it chooses instead to pass judgments that lead to these displacements. Moreover, based on my observations and available data over the years, it's evident that the people affected by forced evictions are encountering increasing difficulties in accessing justice, partly due to the courts reluctance to provide protection and relief. And take, for example, the Tughlaqabad eviction, the largest of its kind in Delhi in this decade. Despite pleas from residents, the Delhi High Court did not grant relief, citing the settlement's absence from the DUSUB list of notified slums. So DUSUB has as the DUSUB policy, for a slum to be secured from rehabilitation or any sort of resettlement, they should be notified under the list of DUSUB slums. And the list is very limited. It has only 675 settlements, which is a very small number. Delhi is a city where 40% of the population is migrants, and it comprises slums only. So of course there will be settlements which will be again eligible in the form of many other criteria, but will not get any sort of rehabilitation just because they are not listed in the DUSUB list. And this rendered around 2 lakh people homeless. So by limiting the due process and rehabilitation requirement to residents of listed settlements, the court disregarded numerous unlisted settlements in Delhi that remain unsurveyed. The court's role should be also to interpret welfare legislation in a manner that extends its benefit to the majority of the population. And unfortunately, that does not seem to be the case at this point. And in the past, if I talk about, even if you can see on the screen over here from 2018 to 2023, we can see how court-led evictions have increased over the time. And in the past, the Indian courts have constructively interpreted the laws to provide relief in cases of housing rights violation, despite the absence of a state law. The Supreme Court of India and several state high courts have consistently affirmed the right to housing, shelter as an inherent component of the fundamental right to life through numerous judgments. The landmark judgment, for example, in Sudama Singh versus Governor of Delhi, and the one is Ajay Makhan versus Union of India, place the duty of state authorities to conduct a survey and provide rehabilitation before carrying out any forcibly act eviction. However, recent court orders related to evictions, particularly in Delhi, if I know, which I can say very surely about, have denied from these precedents. With the continued lack of, I think, coordination between governments, overlapping implementation of housing schemes for the poor, and the recent trend of courts affecting families to be shifted to government-run homeless shelters, thousands of evicted families have been pushed into further marginalization and impoverishment, even after orders from the High Court of Delhi to resettle people affected by eviction. So even in case where High Court or Supreme Court isn't giving judgment that you should resettle these people whoever you have evicted, they've not been rehabilitated on time. In many cases, families have paid for alternative housing after taking personal loans at high interest rates. And while the authorities fight lack of coordination between the central and state government authorities and overlapping implementation of schemes as the reason to this, the evicted families in Delhi are forced to languish in inadequate living conditions, waiting for alternative housing. For example, Anand Parbat, where people from Katputli colony in Delhi are in a transit camp at this point, are waiting for their rehabilitation housing for like 7 years. It was promised that they will get a rehabilitation housing in the next 2 years, but it's been almost 7 years now, and those people are still living in the transit camps. And even another example in Kidwai Nagar, around 400 affected persons have been waiting for the allotment of alternate flats since 2017. And despite the directions from the High Court of Delhi, they're still not getting it. Furthermore, in my own interactions with the lawyers and activists, I think I have also observed a shift. Initially, they were not hesitant to resort to the courts, believing that the judiciary would take a favorable stance. But however, it has now reached a point where approaching the court almost guarantees an eviction order. People themselves are wary of the court issuing a final judgment, understanding the potential consequences it may entail. Yeah, I think I believe it's best to conclude over here only. Allow me to leave you with another number. So approximately 17 million people in India currently live under the constant threat of eviction and displacement. And this equates to nearly 1 in every 100 individuals in India facing potential displacement due to government plans or interventions. So I don't know how long we have to keep talking about this issue where it becomes relevant for authorities to take actions, And also it's, I think it's also important just to give a note that the statistics I've referred through this discussion are conservative estimates, These actual numbers could be much higher because even Namesh and Amit was also pointing out, most of these things goes unreported. So and most of these collisions which we are trying to do over here are also secondary in nature. So if they are not being reported directly from the ground, we do not know where are they. Yeah. I hope I was in time, Namesh. Or
Yes, perfectly. Just a minute, but that's perfectly fine. Thank you so much, Anuj. This was such a powerful presentation. And I think with where you have ended this kind of naturally brings me to the first question that I had. And I think this is a question to both of you, where I really want to know, are we looking at a really bleak future, especially when we see that with the courts now, also citing for the evictions to happen along with all the major stakeholders in an urban setting? Do you actually foresee an end of forced evictions anytime in the near future in an urban setting? Maybe I'll start with you, Anuj, and then I'll go to Amit.
I actually do not know the answer, but I think it's coming from from my instinct, where I think there's no end to it sooner. Especially with the current government regimes, we do not know how long we're gonna keep talking about these issues. For example, even this number which we are referring about, the 17 million people, you can just see how many people are still in the line to get evicted. How many people are still living in the anxieties of getting displaced, And this is across country. It's not just a phenomenon which is again limited to urban centers. Of course, urban centers, again, there's a skewness towards urban center because we have much more information which is available from the urban centers coming. But I do not think so. The government is going to do anything revolutionary to say that there's no eviction zone in future. I don't know. I do not see that coming very soon. I think the future lies a little difficult ahead. For example, even just imagine that to reach out to the 17 million number, the kind of research we did was to attempt to understand that there's so many government projects which they are planning haphazardly. For example, take the example of Dharavi's redevelopment project. It's a project which is going to displace so many people, and it's inevitable now. So even though, and we know how these projects will be executed, even though how much ever the people are going to dissent or anything. So I do not know. I actually don't know the perfect answer to this, but I don't feel like this is going to be an end to it soon.
Thank you, Anush. Amit?
Yeah, I'm not bringing much hope here either. Yeah, it's unfortunate, but if history is any evidence of what the future might be, it looks like we are going to stay with this. And the way I look at this is that there is an extreme inequality. And then on top of that, there is political economy of land in urban areas. If you combine these two, you would see that forced evictions for the benefit of few is a pattern that's going to continue to hold until the underlying structural aspects are fixed, right? The land is undersupplied, is already occupied by urban poor because they don't have any other way to go. And eventually someone has an interest in that land parcel. If you just think about political economy of land alone and think about who the people are that are being victimized and those who are victimizing, that doesn't look like a bright future, at least in foreseeable time. So if we take a longer look at the history and consider developed countries as any example, because they also had their share of slums and long history of slums, they have reached to a point where evictions are a little bit more humane. There's still eviction. If you consider gentrification as a normal process, then it's fine. But it's still a forced eviction in some sense, where market forces push poor people out. So if you consider that as a fair and human process, then maybe we'll get to better way of evicting people. But it's still a force that is not a willing move in many cases. The scale changes. It's not as big a scale as it is right now in our country. But maybe with economic development in several decades, we will see a different future, but not in my lifetime. I'm pretty old.
You talked about this important aspect of the political economy of land, Amit, and that kind of explains one of the major reasons why the inequality leads to slum dwellers being maybe if I could use the term scapegoats for such forced evictions that happen. Do you think that is the primary reason for such an aggressive stance that the the state often takes when it has to undertake forced evictions?
That's one of the major ones. If we look at other triggers like events where the image of the city is a major driving force, that's a different story. Like Dharavi has been there for 3 generations or over. Wasn't big of a problem when the land was not of that importance for the city of Mumbai. But when it's getting towards the middle of the city as city center moves, there is always a heightened interest over time. And there has always been an eviction attempt and a resistance. And we are probably at the tipping point where political economy is saying, this is too expensive to not evict. Right. So that's one. But then we have seen evictions where political economy has nothing to do with it. It's like, Mr. Trump is passing through this in Ahmedabad, so Saranya Nagar gets a wall in front of it. Like Saranya Nagar had no connection with this event. And sometimes like things that are completely off guard, right? Like the image of the city, all of a sudden new mayor or new chief minister thinks I want to showcase this city as a new brand for India, then the local political economy has nothing to do with it. It has more to do with national aspiration, what we stand as new India drives some of it. So I think in the mix, there are many things, and it's very case-specific context in most cases. But overall, the chronic reason behind all of that has been the political economy of land, in my opinion.
Yeah, Anuj, if I can just rephrase the same question to you, with respect to your interactions with journalists, with lawyers, and also with communities on the ground. Do you think the communities basically kind of attribute this kind of aggressive stance to their position in the society as such?
I absolutely agree on that. I think, like I said, it's just now it has become a way where the government is trying to assert its power and position through the bulldozer, especially the way, again, the minorities are being targeted. And I don't have actually much to say around it, Namesh, to be precise, But for example, with our recent experiences, I can see, I can tell you, even during my research work, through my journalism reporting as well, and even my interaction with groundwork activists and lawyers, everybody, whosoever I've encountered have only asserted the fact that the difficulties have increased over the time. In the sense, because, and again, the answer lies again in the political environment of this country, how we are functioning and how we are moving ahead. But for example, not getting immediate relief. So for example, even whenever we used to hear like, oh, there's an eviction notice which has been pasted in one of the settlements, our immediate action would be like, oh, let's go to the court and file a court case, because or file a petition, because we know that these people are living and they are fully eligible for rehabilitation or everything. But how these things have changed so dramatically over the time that even like, for example, even if we try to go to the court these days, and we know that we're not going to get a judgment which is in the behalf of the Basti people, and eventually it will lead to an eviction. So we have rather trying to change our ways of navigating through these situations. We'd rather go to maybe an MLA, asking them to, can you just hold it for 2 weeks? Can you just hold it for 1 week? Can you just give them 1 week at time so that they can settle into from one place to another? And we try to do these bare minimum negotiations, so that in those bare minimum negotiations, we can try figuring out some larger things, maybe we can try finding a solution that these people get something out of the lands they're actually sitting on for like 100 years or 50 years or 20 years even. Yeah. I do not know if I precisely answered your question, Namesh. I think I got slightly... Okay.
I think you have. And again, when you talked about this, again, I think this would be maybe the last question from my end as well, just based on what you just responded. And I think this is out of sheer curiosity that even I have had as a researcher while working on this topic and having studied and having read quite a few papers on this. And I keep thinking, like, what is it that stops the government from pursuing a human approach, like a very humane approach, when it comes to evicting slums? I mean, Amit talked about some cases, especially that has been happening in the global north now, where the governments now realize that, okay, there might be a better way instead of just using the bulldozer as a way of clearing the land away. So what is stopping for something like that to happen in the Indian context, at least?
I think again the answer lies again in the fact that the bulldozer is also becoming a place of power where it's becoming punitive. It's a way where how how punishments are being given these days to people. And also, so what if just imagine bulldozing someone's house because you're claiming that, oh, these group of people like these group of people were trying to interrupt the Ram Navami procession, for example. So you're allowed, when you build such narratives around these people, it becomes easier for you to not follow these humane approaches,
Yeah.
And even then, when talking about humane approaches, and I think just imagine like they going to Tughlaqabad demolition, the Tughlaqabad site where they literally remove 2 lakh people. In properly informed. So, for example, they give a proper notice to all the settlements, like, oh, you have a 1 month time, you do what you want to do. But in that 1 month, the duration of 1 month, people can actually organize themselves. Yes. And that's what the current regime is afraid of, that people will come together, they'll organize. So, so these ways of eviction, that's what I'm trying to say. Like, it's not like evictions have not occurred before. Congress have literally did the same things. But the way the current political regime is trying to conduct these demolition drive is to assert its own power and to make sure that no evidences are being left. If people are being displaced, then they don't even have the time to even dissent. They don't even have time to like stand up for anything,
Amit, if I could bring in your perspective on this.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I should say that we kept talking about India, but we had a privilege of reviewing the entire global South. The story is not different anywhere else. So it's a sorry state. I think overall, until you recognize right to the city for all, until you recognize that this population is not trying to do all these socially negative constructions that you have, like invading your spaces or encroaching your places or being eyesore to your otherwise normal neighborhood. All of those things, some of these are structural, some of these are cultural, some of these are intentionally done because it has direct implication to who gets elected, because there is a sizable middle class who would applaud a bulldozing event. Right. So that's culture. That's like when as a society we think, and this is all utopian. You ask an academic, that's all we have to offer. But I would say until we recognize people as equal and get to some mature democratic setup where everyone has a voice and a right to the basic things. I mean, the first thing is to stop calling them criminals. Stop. There's not an encroachment. There are lots of encroachment in city of Delhi and Mumbai. Not all encroachments are labeled the same way, right? Take multiple cities in Gujarat went through what they call impact fees. So if you are wealthy, you bail yourself out of encroachment. You encroach your balcony into the street, pay for it, and it's formal now. Can I do the same with my plastic tarp on the pavement in Mumbai?
Absolutely not.
Right? So it's not, it's that recognition that all of us have things that we have done, and some are able to escape and some are not. And it's all ingrained in our fabric. So this othering based on poverty and class and other marginalizations, until that goes away, I don't think governments have any incentive to anything differently. And that's the political reality of this.
Thank you so much, Amit, for this response. Now I move to the last part of this panel where I'll kind of try to bring in some of the questions that have been put by our participants as well as as well as our panelists over here. The first question is for Amit, and I'm combining both the questions that that have been put by Preeti and Vidya. The first is if you can just broadly give an understanding of the importance of slums in cities, or even talking about like what do slums do for the cities at all, and then subsequently with respect to with the existence of the slums, what kind of policies actually exist to protect slum dwellers, if at all, and how do they look like?
Great questions. I think many people don't realize that slums actually run the cities because, so take a small example. In Mumbai, 54% of slum population occupies 6% of land, which means they're almost invisible. You don't see them. You don't see them because they take less space. You don't see them because they work when you're sleeping. So you wake up to the street that is clean. It's not your municipal corporation and your tax. It's the people who have come before the municipal truck comes. And so there's a whole economy of recycling in Dharavi. If you take them out, Mumbai will not function even for a day. Who built Mumbai? Who built Delhi? Who built all the cities around the country? Who is constructing all these buildings, all these skyscrapers? If you think about them, they are the people who are constructing without a home, constructing your homes without a home for themselves. These are the seasonal migrant workers who come for construction, go away, right? So if you think about all the city functions, the activities that happen in urban areas, even the services you use as middle class, like your people who come for your household chores or drive your kids around, or anybody, ask them where do they disappear after they serve you. You would realize that these things go hand in hand. Formal and informal are not separable. These cities do not function without both these aspects not being close to each other. And we want them. It's not that we don't want them. These evictions are superficial as such. We want him to find somewhere else, but stay around. So if you just look around and ask people that you suspect might not be living in the kind of house you have, you will find out. So yes, I think absolutely critical function. It's not even a separate group. That it's all of us, and some of us are not able to afford a decent housing. That's as plain. They're doing the same thing that you're doing. In terms of policy, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to tell you that. Yeah, please go ahead.
In terms of policy, I think that I charted some of those. It's historically those are the main responses. You either provide public housing, either you, the sites and services was a major 1970s thing in India and elsewhere in the global south that World Bank drove. The evidence is that once you evict people and ask them to go somewhere else, whether you provide a serviced land, which means there's water supply and sanitation, you build your own house. That didn't happen. And when it happened, those homes went to someone who was able to afford them. And so the poor actually were displaced. So the sites and services sites are thriving, but they are occupied by the people who also wanted housing stock. So if you think about housing supply in Indian cities, it's always in short supply for everyone. So if you build something for the extreme poor, it's going to be taken away by a class above them. And that's the hierarchy. So ultimately, it's the extreme poor who runs around. So sites and services, in my opinion, is not successful. There are some new studies that says it's successful, but my suspicion is that people who it was meant for are not the ones occupying it. There's slum redevelopment, in situ redevelopment, which I think is the only feasible solution. Let them live where they're living, in the house they're living. If they're missing water, provide water. That's even so. Slum, non-slum is a dichotomy that's wrong. First of all, an urban planner can provide water, can provide sanitation. So measure how many people don't have water, how many people don't have toilet, because that's what you can do. An urban planner cannot turn a slum into a non-slum because that's just a nomenclature. What's the deprivation? Can you handle that? And so in situ upgradation, the people upgrading their house, municipal corporation providing services where they didn't, electricity companies providing electricity where they didn't, is the only successful example we have seen so far around the world. Everything else, the cities without slums, etc., is a rhetoric. How? Cities without slums, how? Broader structural change like inequality going away, housing becoming affordable to all classes. That's an ideal situation that I don't think it exists anywhere in the world. So, I'll stop here.
Thank you. Anuj, the next question is for you, and this is more in terms of understanding the role of the media when it comes to looking at forced evictions and shaping the narratives around slums as such. So do you, first of all, this is primarily to understand what is the responsibility of journalists in the way of how this narrative is shaped. And again, with respect to talking about the future, what do you think should be is the future of the media's role when it comes to evictions?
So I think currently there is, I won't say there's no sensitivity towards reporting towards these issues. For example, of course, we have our national news channels where people would come and say things like, "Oh, Mama ka bulldozer," and thing. But I think the print or the digital media is still very sensitive to raise these issues appropriately. But even as a practice, even as someone who's currently covering stories or of evictions over ground, what I can say is there's a reluctance by even those progressive platforms to even keep publishing around these narratives of evictions and demolitions. Because the scrutiny on the entire media sphere has increasing so much that anything which is too blatant or too much on the face is very difficult to report. So even we usually asked to tone down a little, maybe not say this but say this. And I also think in terms of media reporting, there's also lack in the sense, in the lag in the sense how the reportage is covered. For example, in many cases, you see an eviction which occurred in Chhapra of Bihar, but like. So sometimes these information becomes pointless after a point. You just know something happened around these times, these days. We do not know what is the reason for it. Who were the affected people? I mean, I won't be sad if fanning farms would be demolished one day in Delhi. I mean, I'm absolutely okay with that. But so I really want to know what's going on. So I think with the reportage, I really want to know what's going on. Yeah.
Thank you. The next question is something that has come up a couple of times, and this is something which is a critical aspect is in terms of understanding the gendered perspective towards evictions, where
Absolutely.
we look at how evictions do they, I mean, when we assume they affect women more than men, and with respect. Yeah. So this is more in terms of like vis-a-vis the violence of evictions that happen. Like, can you just talk a little bit about from a gendered perspective? Yeah.
I'll give you one case. If Amit, you want to go first or something? Okay. I'll give you one example from my fieldwork in November or December, something. This was one family which has been resettled over there in Bhavana. Almost supposedly, like Bhavana is also kind of a transit situation for them. People are literally not clear, is this going to be a transit house or it will be a permanent settlement for them, Abhigilia. And these people were evicted from the site of Katputli colony that is almost near to Connaught Place and center to almost 40 kilometers in the peripheries of Delhi. Now, I encountered this one family where there's just one husband and wife, and they have 2 children. And when I talked to the husband, I asked him, what do you do? And this person says, I work in Patel Nagar. I go on bike every day and I work on some Domino's outlet ke upar. And it's a job he's continuing doing even post the eviction. So before the eviction, he was also working on the same Domino's outlet in Patel Nagar. And even after the eviction, he's continuing working over there. Of course, the cycle of travel has increased. Initially, it was a distance of 4 kilometers, 3 kilometers. Now it's a distance of 25 kilometers, which he's traveling over the bike. Over the same, in the same household, even if you look at uska wife's situation, their wife was actually teaching in one of the schools around Connaught Place, and then they were taking tuitions at around in their own jhugi only. But later on, when they were relocated to Bhavana, which is again 40 kilometers to the site, and we know how patriarchy and how systems are constructed around women. So men would absolutely find a bike to go and travel these distances of 25 kilometers. But apparently the wife of the person left working. She's currently not working anymore. So just imagine that. It's just one example. In many cases, for example, if you talk about many fairy-wala women who exchange clothes with utensils doing fairy in Delhi. I mean, I'm pretty sure many of you guys have encountered them. Who actually live in Raghubir Nagar in Delhi and now have been resettled to parts like in Bakkarwala or Favda Ghivra. Now where they're traveling like a distance of 20 kilometers again back and forth to just do their do their basic livelihood. So of course the impacts are always gendered, always skewed. And in Indian cities, I would say where the place where you get to live is absolutely answered by the. So housing is also a question of identity, and I think that's how I would like to answer it.
Amit, if you want to quickly add anything to this.
Yeah, I'll just say that the impacts are of most shocks, like even climate change events or evictions, are gendered within a slum. So a man in the same slum would not be impacted as much as women. That's kind of studied and understood. Evictions, no exceptions. There is one saving grace, and I think one good news is that if a resistance has to succeed, they are usually, so this is a new thing that we are finding in papers, that when they are led by women or children, they are more likely to succeed in resisting evictions or stop the eviction process. And so that's the power of women that we fairly recently discovered this in scientific papers. Everything Namesh and I are saying are actually based on what other people have studied. So it's a borrowed knowledge, but it's emerging as a theme that when the resistance is led by women, it's more likely to succeed. But if eviction does happen, then the impact is also high on women, negative impact.
That's great. Thank you so much, Amit. Considering that we are almost at the closing phases of this panel, what I would like to do is, instead of me summarizing what has happened here, it would be great if I can invite both of you just to provide maybe one statement as a learning lesson that you think can be the way ahead when we look at whatever we've been discussing so far. Maybe I'll start with you, Amit.
Yeah, I'll just call for a more humane approach. If you have to go through eviction process, do it as a procedural justice at least, and if possible, protecting all the human rights. So anyone who is involved in carrying out this, if you're a student or a researcher, I would say that study this subject. Is an understudied subject, underreported phenomena, and a lot less vocally, discussed in academia to change, to move the needle. So that's my appeal, depending on who you are.
Thank you, Amit. Anuj.
I think I would like to just say one thing. I think there should be an immediate national moratorium on forced evictions. That's it. There should be no evictions, as simple as that. There could be no development which literally pushes people out of their homes. I do not stand for it. And I really feel like there should be nothing as called as special purpose, this purpose. It should be just a moratorium on forced evictions. That's it.
I think everyone who's in this panel and in this meeting would absolutely agree with you on this. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Patel and Anuj, for being a part of this discussion. I think both of your talks have just reiterated what we believe has what we think has been completely a worrisome trend when we look at evictions around the city in Delhi and around the country, and of course in the global south as well. And as researchers, as scholars, the least that we can do is start being more and more aware about it so that we can push that in the narratives further. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for providing and sharing your valued knowledge with us. And with this, I guess we can formally close the first panel and move to the next. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nimesh. I think we're going to wait for a few minutes.
Sure.
Our panelists for the second panel are going to join us. And once I say, I think the